We often take our sexuality for granted, thinking that we are born with a certain set of sexual identities. But it is not entirely true, because there is a realm in which these sexualities are shaped. And there is no other science better than psychoanalysis, which was invented single-handedly maybe by Sigmund Freud, who talked about inner processes through which sexualities are shaped. He talked about Oedipus complex. He talked about a level of consciousness which are split into two. Subconscious is a place where a lot of repression takes place and gets stored, and that also has a role to play in how our sexualities are shaped. For a very long time, this particular understanding was very influential till Jacques Lacan came in 1950s, influenced largely by Saussure's linguistic philosophy. And he thought that this whole notion of subconscious basically was a bit different. It was structured like language. It was informed by a symbolic order, and it is through this symbolic ordering that sexualities are shaped. Particularly feminine sexuality has been talked about as a certain kind of lack, that is to say, lacking a certain kind of sexual organ and realizing about its absence. A lot of feminists have interrogated this particular conceptualization of how feminine sexuality is built, and they have critiqued. Even Lacan, for example, is critiqued by feminists. But Lacan provided an extraordinary realm, which is the realm beyond this symbolic order, beyond this phallic order. All these concepts that we are going to talk about today, because we have an extraordinary practicing psychoanalyst philosopher, Dr. Frank Rollier, present with us, who will be discussing today with us Lacan and feminine sexuality, a clinical approach. Dr. Rollier is a practicing psychoanalyst who also teaches in Paris University and is a member of World Association of Psychoanalysis, also closely related to Lacanian school. And also the important factor is that he offers free psychoanalytical services and help to teenager students in France. I welcome you, Dr. Rollier, in our studio, and we hope to have a wonderful lecture on all these issues, particularly about how feminine sexuality is shaped according to psychoanalytical understanding, particularly through the writings of Jacques Lacan.
As an introduction, I would like to make a few preliminary remarks. It is a difficult issue to talk about feminine sexuality, because each of us has psychological and sociological prejudices or blind spots regarding sexuality. I am aware, although certainly in a too basic way, of the Indian specificities regarding women's social status. What I will expose today represents only some fruits of psychoanalytical experience, based on the analysis of Western women and the breakthroughs led by Dr. Lacan, both on theoretical and clinical sides. It doesn't constitute a single reading, a new philosophy or morality, neither in a kind of teaching. I am talking to you rather from the position of an analysant, a patient undergoing an analysis, who knows the speaking beings we are inhabited by passion of ignorance. And also, as an analysant, I am someone who seeks to be taught by the experience we are sharing. In the Victorian times, Freud, the inventor of psychoanalysis, allowed feminine sexuality to emerge from ignorance and contempt. But he eventually stumbled upon the question of what does the woman, if we translate literally, what does the woman want? In a conversation with Marie Bonaparte, the French analyst and Freud student who organized his escape from the Nazi Vienna, he recognized this question remained his abutment point, in spite, he said, of 30 years studying the feminine soul. Previously, he had stated that the sexual life of an adult woman was a dark continent for psychology, borrowing this formula from Stanley, the explorer of deep Africa, mysterious and dangerous, of course. Basically, Freud's approach is based on a comparison between feminine sexuality and the masculine one, with the phallus as the only parameter, A person either has one or doesn't. And this was supposed to lead women in analysis to face what he called her penisnade, the absence of penis, and then the rock of castration, which, in his view, was the outcome of an analysis. I am making these points just for the record. Lacan, in a fresh reading of Freud's work, qualified this approach as a religious one, orientated by his belief in an omnipotent father and the dogma of the phallus as exclusive operator for both genders. During the 70s of the last century, when feminism was intense in the West, Lacan faced the question of feminine sexuality in his teaching. Based on the experience of psychoanalysis, and much to the audience's surprise, Lacan proposed a theory which radically upset Freud's assertions and opened a new clinical approach. It is specifically in his seminar called in French Encore, which means more and again, and which has been translated under the title The Limits of Love and Knowledge, Feminine Sexuality. It is in this seminar that is dealing specifically with this topic. Freud, Lacan said, made a mistake. When he was asking what does the woman want, he thought there was the woman. But in fact, the woman, states Lacan, doesn't exist. There are only women one by one. And he added, the woman is a man's dream. At the same time, Lacan made this fresh reading of Freud's thinking regarding feminine sexuality. He also went beyond Freud's theories regarding a possible treatment of psychotic patients. And he also brought into question the way Freud organized the psychoanalytic group and the way the analysts known as post-Freudian were organizing the analysts' training on a hierarchical pattern, just like in a church. There is a common point to the three breakthroughs, which is a criticism of the fascination for the imaginary order, which leads immediately to mirror effects and ego competition. Beside the imaginary, Lacan emphasized the symbolic function. And third term, what he called the real being what escapes to all symbolization process, what remains outside language. To illustrate this point while staying in today's topic, we can figure out these three different plans regarding the first sexual encounters or relationships a young person may have. On the one hand, it will symbolize the access to an adult's status, and on the other, it will be the basis on which all the imaginary identifications will unfold, whether feminine and or virile. And on a third plan, there is the real of the act, which escapes symbolization and imagination because it is the encounter of something nobody is really prepared for, and which digs a hole in the knowledge previously established. Actually, this may lead sometimes to drastic clinical consequences. Now, jouissance on the male side and on the female side. First, Lacan introduced the concept of jouissance, which is a French word, which is not so far from enjoyment or ecstasy, but still is different. And that's why the tradition is to keep the French word of jouissance, which in Lacan's view indicates a property of a living body and a condition beyond pleasure. Pleasure becomes jouissance at the moment it overflows the body's knowledge and ceases to obey to the mind, when it becomes stronger than me, stronger than I am, as patients very often say. Then jouissance may have a pleasant side, but also a painful one. For example, Freud related that the rat man, one of his famous patients, while he was telling the story of a torture, had on his face, said Freud, a very strange expression of horror at pleasure of his own, of which he himself was unaware. This word pleasure, Lust in German, we translate by jouissance, because contrary to pleasure, it is of no use, except its own requirement. Beyond pleasure, Lacan shows, that each subject has the choice to inscribe his or her sexual jouissance either on the masculine or the feminine side, with no respect to anatomy or civil status. This is a choice she or he makes unconsciously. Why is there this possibility of a choice beside all the social constraints and identifications? Because, as Lacan puts it, there is no such thing as sexual relation. That's a quotation. Quite a provocative assertion, which means that if there are, of course, sexual relationships between human beings, there is no mathematic formula which could be written and could guarantee that regarding sex, it will work out between partners, whether they recognize themselves as a woman, as a man, or I would add, as belonging to any other gender, or to be free from any gender identification. At a psychical level, there is no program which could assure the perfect match between a woman and a man, although societies try to promote such a script, each one in its own way. And you, of course, in India have a very specific experience of that. In our modern times, we observe that it is what dating sites try to achieve in a lucrative attempt to face this structural impossibility. But if there is no such thing as sexual relation for both sexes, there is only one signifier for desire, the phallus. Phallus is not so much the anatomic organ than a signifier, which introduces a logical function in the unconscious. As a signifier, the phallus belongs both to imaginary and symbolic orders. It represents life and its perpetuation, desire and jouissance. For example, you will tell me if I'm wrong or not, it seems to me that the lingam representations play that function. On another plan, phallus symbolizes what everyone desires to get, but never gets exactly, because it always escapes. In that way, it is a signifier of castration, and thus also of what is lacking to everyone. And what is lacking to anyone is what we call desire. The law that is transmitted by the father and that states the prohibition against incest is also the foundation of desire. And this is the law of castration, which Lacan designated as the phallic function itself. This is the level Lacan brought out and emphasized. The phallus humanizes desire and allows it to be operational, because giving a meaning to it. Thus, it is a medium between sexes, which enables a meeting to be possible. When it isn't operating, the subject faces a hole, a void, and that is what we observe in psychosis. Could be actually one definition of psychosis. Let's go back now to the issue of jouissance. Rather than considering the anatomy or even the identifications, Lacan puts forward the question of jouissance, and he states, from his clinic with patients in analysis, not from philosophical thoughts, but from his clinic, that regarding jouissance, there is an asymmetry between men and women, although both of them first have to determine themselves in respect to the phallic dimension. And they both have in common this mode of jouissance called phallic jouissance, which is related to the masculine organ. Now let's consider the differences. First, on the man's side. Why starting with the male? It's always the same old story, you might say. It is because his way of dealing with jouissance is the easiest one, a piece of cake. Here reigns the phallus as a wall, and male's jouissance has a perverse orientation. The object for his jouissance taking the shape of a fetish, a little something, what Lacan calls the object little a. A little something is seeking with his partner. It might be a certain color of hair or skin. A patient of mine says he's only attracted by women with smooth hair. Breasts, tone of voice, way of laughing, of walking, of cooking. The Wolfsman, another famous Freud's case, was exclusively sexually attracted by squatting servants. A specific object is sufficient for the male's jouissance, which therefore is limited, precisely localizable, and requires no words. Jacques-Alain Miller, our famous colleague, who established and published Lacan's seminars and has been tirelessly commenting Lacan's works for more than 30 years, talks about an erotic of silence, especially obvious with male homosexuals. And that's why people say colloquially that all men are alike, and women complain they are not talkative, and just have one thing in their mind, i.e. to get the object they are longing for. All alike, but in Aristotelian logic, one can't say all alike without the existence of an exception. It is the very existence of an exception which allows to stand that all the others are alike, which gives consistency to this set. This is following Frege, I don't know how you pronounce it, logic, Frege being follower of Cantor, who founded the set theory. This is a myth Freud made clear with his father of the herd in his book Totem and Taboo. He who ignores castration, he who is all-powerful and possesses all women of the group. We all know men who dream to incarnate this myth. On the woman's side now, or more exactly on the feminine part of the speaking beings, women's jouissance is not wholly within the phallic function. It is not all within it. It goes beyond. Lacan calls it other jouissance, which is unique to her, not localizable, and has affinities with the infinite. What at first sight appears in a woman as incomplete, marked by a minus sign, this is of course the phallic side, appears on the other side to be without limits, which doesn't mean a woman never has limits, actually. As subject of the unconscious, a woman's jouissance is thus divided between phallic jouissance, linked to castration, and the other jouissance that is not regulated by castration and is unique to her. Thus, there is neither symmetry between the two sides of this sex fashion table, as Lacan calls it, nor any complementarity between the sexes. Lacan calls this jouissance a supplementary jouissance, not a complementary one. We could state that this distinction also rights the misunderstanding between sexes, even when a sexual act is considered successful for both. There is no hope for a perfect union of partners gathered in the same harmonious jouissance. The woman's other jouissance, on which man has no access in any way, isn't submitted to any prohibition, for it isn't submitted to the phallic law. However, not all women get an access to it. Not all women and not all the times, or not at all times. According to the Aristotelian logic, on this side there is no exception that could serve as a basis for a set of women. In this perspective, there is no set of women. One can talk about women only one by one. All of them are exceptions. Or in other words, each one is an exception. There is an open set. It is from this fact that Lacan derived the formula woman doesn't exist. This formula leaves no room for any idea of an essence of femininity. Because it is not dependent upon the symbolic function of the phallus, this other jouissance remains outside of the symbolic order, i.e. outside meaning and knowledge. That's why women can't talk about it. On the contrary, phallic jouissance gives rise to much debate, either in the privacy or, of course, in the form of jokes. However, this feminine jouissance might be figured occasionally in dreams. For example, Miller, our colleague I previously mentioned, reported a patient's dream in which was figured a swirling geyser, gushing with inexhaustible life. A geyser to which, noted Miller, she always tried to be equal in her life. This last remark points out that this other jouissance, with its dimension of being out of limits, is not confined to the strict sexual experience and may sometimes be a characteristic of some women's lifestyle. In the same way, a patient of mine dreamed that her car had failed brakes and went on gliding along inexorably. And besides, she complains of always moving too fast in her life with no limits. Whereas women don't talk about it, or rarely so, mystics do give evidence of this other jouissance through their infinite love for God. They testify through their writings that they experience a jouissance beyond any order, infinite or eternal and not localizable. Let's take, for example, Teresa of Avila, who wrote, "I used unexpectedly to experience a consciousness of the presence of God, of such a kind that I could not possibly doubt that he was within me or that I was wholly engulfed in him. This was in no sense a vision," she said. She wrote, "The soul is suspended in such a way that it seems to be completely outside itself. The will loves. The memory is almost lost." Actually, Teresa of Avila figures in the front page of the seminar Encore I mentioned, and you have just there the sculpture made by Bernini of the ecstasy of St. Teresa of Avila. You may see when you go to Rome. It's a very beautiful sculpture. Lacan praised a lot. After a woman, let's take the example of a man, St. John of the Cross, who wrote, for example, there are many possible quotations, "O sweet coterie, O delightful wand, O gentle hand, O delicate touch that tastes of eternal life and pays every debt. In killing, you changed death to life." Maybe Mirabai's ecstatic poems could give also a demonstrative picture of this infinite love and jouissance. And some poets may as well point out that direction beyond desire. And I would like to quote Professor Savita Singh, who is also a poet, and who concludes one of her poems with this verse, "And there is a woman moving beyond thirst." So she will tell us if she agrees with this proximity. The fact this jouissance appears being infinite and non-localizable led a provocative Lacan to assert that all women are crazy, immediately adding, "not crazy at all." And he also added, "they are accommodating rather, to the point where there is no limit to the concessions made by any woman for a man, of her body, her soul, her possessions." To sum up, there is an opposition between jouissance on the man's side and love on the woman's side. For a man, love appears to be a supplement to his jouissance, occasionally as a semblance, which veils his own jouissance, going without saying. For a woman, although not localizable and not limited to the phallic organ, this jouissance occurs in the body. But it is also a jouissance of speech. As a matter of fact, for a woman, this other jouissance requires some words from her partner. It requires love, as love doesn't exist without words. That means that her access to this other jouissance relies to a great extent to the fact that her partner takes into account her specific mode of jouissance, the fact that she may be radically other for him and foreign to his fantasy. There is a sequence: talk, love, and joy. The German word Liebe, used by Freud, includes this dimension, as it designates love, desire, and jouissance in one word, as Miller stated it. Lacan even proposed that it is through talking that we do make love. Could be the topic of another lecture. Now, and before I finish, I would like to mention some consequences of this disparity regarding jouissance. I will mention 6 points briefly, and if you agree, we may discuss them afterwards in another time. First point, hatred of women is specifically hate of their singular jouissance. Second point, a man may be a devastation for a woman. Lacan calls it a ravage. Third point, Nowadays, at a time when, at least in the West, the equivalence mother-woman is no more a given, because of the great number of isolated mothers, what is at stake is a community of jouissance, with a promotion of phallic jouissance for both sexes. Fourth point, this logic of sexuation also contributes to a clinical revival which goes as far as a clinic of psychosis. That is a very large chapter also. Fifth point, on his very late teaching, Lacan has made of this specific feminine jouissance the very shame of jouissance as such. And last one, but it is rather a question. Is there any possible link to be made between this other jouissance beyond words and the concept of ananda one finds in the Upanishad, and which is translated either by joy, delight, pleasure, happiness, or with the concept of Brahman, as it is expressed, for example, in the Taittiriya Upanishad, chapter 3, Brahman beyond speech and thought, I quote, whence all worlds turn back as well as manas, without reaching. He who knows Brahman's bliss fears not at any time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rollier, for a wonderful lecture that you gave. I think we understood the complexity of understanding feminine sexuality, brought out particularly by Lacan, and the interpretation that you presented also made us aware that it is a huge continent, that women's sexuality should not be reduced to its anatomy. An understanding of female sexuality or feminine sexuality is important for both men and women and other sexualities to live together with some sense of understanding, and not to have a sense of regret, anger, ravage, misunderstanding, which leads to all kinds of violence. I think a Lacanian psychoanalysis, even though have been found still sexist by some feminists, others have also taken it up. We have important feminists like Helen Sixus and Julia Kristeva and Luc Irigaray, who have taken Lacan's picturing of this complex reality of feminine sexuality seriously, and they have accepted it, they have adopted it in their own theorizing. I think that this particular lecture will benefit our students, our counselors, and all other people who will listen to it. I thank you again for giving such an enlightening lecture dealing with female sexuality from a Lacanian psychoanalytical perspective. Thank you again.